We're in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giuliano, she, her, and hers, and I am the Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. Today, I am super excited to welcome our next guest onto the interview series, Juliette Austin. She is the Head of Equity and Belonging at Zillow Group. Juliette, it's so good to see you again. If you want to share a little bit about yourself for our listeners, including your pronouns and when you were younger. Do you remember how exactly you answered the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Thank you, Christina. It is a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. Yes, I'm Juliette Austin. My pronouns are she, her, and as you mentioned, I am the head of equity and belonging at Zillow Group. To answer the question, what I wanted to do when I was younger, look, I am a child of immigrant parents, first generation Haitian American, Black woman who grew up in New York City, and anyone who can identify even remotely with immigrant parents, the what I wanted to be when I grew up really was what my parents wanted me to be when I grew up, what they wanted me to be when I grew up, and which was a doctor. And my family never really put any limits on my potential, and I really wanted to do a lot of things, but they were always guiding me towards being a medical doctor. But ultimately, as I think back and really throughout my formative years, I really wanted to do something that was centered around improving the lived experience of Black and Brown people. And even when I was younger, I didn't always have that language specifically, but I knew that this was something that I wanted to be a part of and influence. I didn't know how, outside of just being a medical doctor. But I observed these work environments and institutions that really continuously subjugated people. And being the curious child that I was always asking why, just seeking to understand that root of human behavior and the motivations behind it. So it took me in a lot of directions, and I did pursue being a medical doctor initially, and I really wanted to influence that in a way that was focused on my community. But then I also explored being a lawyer. I studied environmental racism for a short time, political racism, sociology, psychology, cultural anthropology, and history. And all of those things kind of culminated into a path in industrial organizational psychology, and realized that I can apply that in corporate settings, and discovered it kind of didn't know that diversity, equity, and inclusion work existed. And in many cases back then, it wasn't actually defined that way, but it was the path that I took through IO psychology and organizational development. So to answer your question, I wanted to be a lot of things, and I took a lot of different paths to get here.
I really appreciate you sharing your journey to this work. Almost, I think everyone I ask doesn't say, when I was little, I said I wanted to be the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's what I wanted to be. But looking back and seeing kind of what you gravitate towards, what your earlier moments of flow were to having the language when you grow up, it definitely is interesting to look back and have that 2020 hindsight. I know in a lot of these conversations, especially when we're talking about really big topics around improving folks' lives and really looking at how we can create systemic change within our organization. Change doesn't happen overnight. And a lot of folks want to see, where are we making progress? What is the ROI here? Because what gets measured gets invested in, but also we know that this is not a check the box exercise. It's a continuous work. You don't achieve equity at your organization and say, okay, we don't have to work on it next year. What is your philosophy around measuring this dynamic thing of belonging and inclusion at an organization?
Yeah, I like the word that you use there, dynamic, and I think that's an important highlight there. It's measuring a dynamic experience of feeling respected, valued and accepted. It's a sense of social integration into a cultural environment, which is really important to all of us as humans, as human beings. We want to feel integrated into the spaces that we often are in. So it is an individualized experience, and measuring belonging means we have to involve different types of tools and approaches. So with my team, belonging is core to my team's work and a key component of our strategy. And when employees ultimately feel that their company cares for them, it improves engagement, retention, and overall business performance. And so some of those are some of the key indicators or things that we start to measure. Engagement through employee surveys, as an example of that. We look at our retention scores, and our overall business performance as well. But I also recognize that each community has unique experiences and challenges which impact their sense of belonging. So when it comes to measuring that at an organization, it's also important to take both the quantitative and qualitative approach. And like I mentioned, those surveys are a great tool, but it's also important to connect with employees one-on-one through what we host coffee chats. We have meetings with our affinity network members as well. But it's a way to engage with employees and leaderships and other members of our underrepresented communities specifically. And so through these continued connections, we're able to really develop a deeper relationship and understanding of how employees are feeling, going back to, are they feeling accepted, respected, and overall included and valued within the organization.
Yeah, I think it's really important that you continue to ask how people are feeling. People are at different parts of their careers, different parts of their lives, and depending on when you ask and kind of the many different examples of how you ask at Zillow Group as well, it's really important to keep a pulse on as well. I know there are many different projects that I'm sure you're working on in your role as the head of equity and belonging at Zillow Group. And I know that we're moving towards more of a conversation of, it is not Juliette or the chief diversity officer or the diversity, equity, and inclusion program manager's job to make sure all of the organization is equitable, we are diverse, and we're fulfilling those goals. It's everybody's responsibility. From your perspective, what is your unique role in doing this work, and what is it clearly not for folks listening?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I think at a high level, like I lead a team and I work with senior leadership to co-develop and implement a company-wide approach to equity and belonging that is strategic, scalable, and sustainable. My 3 S's, as I call it. So this is about influencing our overarching company culture where all are included, valued, and are able to thrive in their careers. So this includes advancing equity and belonging in 5 key areas. And this is what I focus on and continue to drive. This is part of the role and expectation. Driving belonging at Zillow Group means increasing representation of women and BIPOC employees, increasing retention of our underrepresented employees, deepening our learning and focus on equity and belonging through programming, and ensuring the company and represents the demographic makeup of our total available market, and so through representation. And of course, continuing to ensure our employees are paid equitably. And so we've set those commitments, and that's really at a high level my role. And driving again towards those 3 S's of sustainability, scalability, and being strategic, and in those 5 areas. What it's not, it is not what I call magical wizardry. It is, oftentimes, we approach equity and belonging, or diversity, equity, and inclusion as with this expectation that we'll have like this cape, a magic wand, and a pointy hat, and that will just kind of magically make things happen within an organization, or that the presence of someone or this team is going to somehow transform overnight company culture and direction. And it really doesn't work that way. And we certainly can't snap our fingers or wave the wand and make that change happen instantaneously. Um, this is a very passionate topic, and I know that it feels as though we're never moving urgent enough, and that is true. But it is a journey and it takes time, as cliche as that sounds. And it's something that involves everyone to participate in. And so, to further answer your question, it's not one individual's responsibility. It's not one team's responsibility. It is something that involves everyone to actively participate in, and the onus is on the full company. And I have to often remind others of that as well.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with you. I think oftentimes people compare kind of this work to the product or service of an organization, and you can't sell the product or service without the sales team, without the product team, without the marketing team, and everybody working together as well towards these goals. And I like the three S's of really being strategic. How can you set people up for success as well, and really thinking about it collaboratively too, in terms of everyone having that ownership mentality. What accountability is in place so everybody, especially leaders too, with their unique role, are thinking about equity and belonging in their processes and kind of day to day as well.
Yeah, accountability is one of those words that when we say it in the context of equity and belonging, there tends to be this negative connotation to it, maybe even accusatory. But if you speak about accountability in the context of, let's say, meeting a deadline or a production goal, it's just simply understood. And we expect people to achieve it, or, and people work very hard to get there. So we understand what accountability is, but for a lot of reasons, which may be a whole other a recording in a future topic of what does the accountability really trigger for us, for leaders especially, is an important thing I think to unpack. But it's so important in this space. Accountability ultimately sets the tone and our expectations. Without it, you can't change behavior. You can't know what one you're marching towards. And so, as Zillow, we've created these commitments, which I mentioned before, those 5 commitments to equity and belonging, and created transparency in our data around that, which our leadership team was on board with and was a part of, in agreement to that. And so that transparency in our data is highlighted in our publicized sustainability report, which it comes out every year. And so that is a motivating factor and another accountability measure for leadership. As that data and leveraging those data points and that transparency helps to drive the conversation and continue to brainstorm towards actions and solutions for the future.
Yeah, I think that transparency piece and that effective communication is really critical as well. And I would say is unique to an organization as well. Not all companies are transparent in their kind of goals, how they're working towards these as well, especially with employees. Also, everybody is bringing their own kind of lived experiences, especially in different workplaces, to their current employer as well. And we have to kind of understand that too, even if you work at the best place ever, even if you have an open door policy. I want to ask, how can organizations really identify what we call the kind of quote unquote hidden dangers of toxic managers or misaligned department goals and values, and proactively find them by empowering employees to speak up? What role does anonymous feedback play in your employee listening strategy? Understanding, like you said before, there are multiple avenues and everyone's bringing their own experience to work.
Yeah, I think it's important to provide employees with multiple channels for feedback. And those hidden dangers, you know, the only way to identify them often is through our employees being able to raise those issues and their experience and having a multitude of ways to do that where they feel safe and to do so, and they can find avenues that they trust is important. And it's not a one size fits all approach to giving feedback. Sometimes we want to try to do that in different avenues. Sometimes it's going directly to HR. Sometimes it's not. Um, and that's okay too, which is why anonymous feedback is also so important. And tools like AllVoices and as a third party reporting tool for employees is a very important part of that complexity of options as well. The role of anonymous feedback is an important strategy for identifying those toxic workplace behaviors that are sometimes really hard to identify.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of toxic workplaces, I think that there is a lot of television and press around this idea and the actuality of toxic workplaces. There's been Netflix documentaries, there's been kind of fictional, but also some truth behind it as well. Other documentaries like We Crashed and about Abercrombie and Fitch, about the numerous examples of discrimination that has happened in the past. There's also, lots of television around it, lots of consumption. Is there ever a point of no return for a brand in your eyes because of the amount of harm they caused? If not, what is your advice to initiate that intentional repair? And this is just a general kind of trend question from your perspective and experience in the field.
Yeah, wow, yeah, Christina, there's a lot of interesting content out there just highlighting these toxic workplaces. And I tell you, they're great case studies of what not to do in an organization, right? But I mean, you learn from it. And I don't think that there's ever really truly a point of no return for people or for brands. I think there should be and must be clearly articulated lessons learned, consistent and repeated actions to heal the pain inflicted, along with allowing for time for that to kind of unfold and mature in that healing as well. So I think it's possible to come back from mistakes. And I don't know, the point of no return only happens if there are organizations who are not willing to rectify those issues, keeping that toxic workplace in power. Signals to employees, especially employees from underrepresented communities, that their experience doesn't matter. And ultimately, of course, it kills morale and retention. So if a company is serious about that intentional repair, it's critical that they're addressed and I specifically identified, removed, so that you can start that healing process.
Yeah, acknowledge where you are, what has happened, really own up to it, and also that consistency piece in terms of actions, intentionality, authenticity as well, from everyone, and time. Again, you can't change something overnight as well, or rush the process, and it is a process. On the flip side, I guess, can you tell me about an innovation that you've seen in this equity, belonging, people, company culture space that you are most excited about, and why? One of my favorites is the 4-day work week and just authentic mental health benefits, love therapy. What are some of yours, or one specifically?
Yeah, all of the above that you mentioned, Christina. I think
Yeah.
that, the last 2 years have really forced companies to reevaluate the future of work, which I'm excited about. I think that, prior to that, there was always this conversation of what is the future of work, and then we just kind of was thrust into it, whether we wanted to or not. We had to rethink how we operate. How do we build community and connection in a virtual world for the most part? Um, and so we had to question, how do we work creatively, and how do we interact? So it's different now, but it lends itself to new opportunities. And so innovation in this space is really meant to increase access to underrepresented groups, especially, and to including women. And it allows us to, especially at Zillow Group, where we've adopted a flexible hybrid work environment. Um, and it changed how we connected with different communities across the country, and in terms of our representation and how people work and the flexibility it gave them in their lives. And I think that's the innovative edge now, in equity and belonging, is allowing or giving our employees um, the ability to make choices and decisions and have options on how they want to work and how they want to integrate their lives in that as well. So that flexibility becomes so important, but it also means that we also have to think critically and innovatively about how do we maintain, this new work environment, and not get lost in virtual remote world either.
Yeah, creating those meaningful connections in a distributed, in a virtual world, they are big questions, and it requires a lot of creativity, testing, asking for that feedback as well, especially as the company continues to grow too. How do we ensure that folks feel like they are seen, heard, and understood? And flexibility is related to equity. It's related to supporting working parents. It's related to supporting folks at different parts of their careers. So really taking a lens and understanding that as well. I would love to ask for June 2022, how is Zillow Group honoring and celebrating Pride this year, which I'm sure this is something that you're doing and supporting LGBTQIA plus employees 365 days a year. I've met some of your ERG leaders who are incredible as well, but always like to ask.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Again, you're absolutely right. This is something we celebrate 365 days a year, and it's absolutely important to us. We have our Pride Affinity Network, which has organized a really comprehensive agenda of events and activities for the network and allies to come together and celebrate the LGBT community plus community. Pride is hosting cross-network discussions with other networks, and so being mindful of intersectionality in that space. We're also discussing foundation work of civil rights activist Polly Murray, including gender equality, desegregation, and the intersectional tools we can use to combat oppression as a whole. We also have a speaker series as well, where we bring in external thought leaders to discuss and explore these topics of social identity, equity, and belonging that impact this community specifically as well. Externally, we're also spotlighting members of our Pride and Zillow Group Life social accounts, and we're going to celebrate the community as well. So we have a lot of interesting and fun things happening, but I think it's important overall that the community is just able to come together and just be with each other and learn from each other in different ways.
Yeah, it sounds like a really comprehensive program. Again, something you're doing all year round as well. I love the intersectionality piece of these conversations too. Juliette, as we wrap up our time together, is there anything that I didn't ask you want to share with folks who are listening, or underscoring any key takeaways you hope people bring with them?
This has been a great conversation, and thank you for having me. If there's anything that I would add, I would say, look, equity and belonging is so important to the success and culture of any organization, and it's not meant to be sidelined or tokenizing. And so it's important that we give it the same standing as any other business function or professional practice, and really develop it. It takes a lot of hard work, a lot of commitment, and and dedication to achieve this. And so I encourage organizations and teams and individuals to also recognize their own accountability in this space and do something, one thing, anything to have a positive impact on your team. Maybe it's just a colleague, but ultimately the company as a whole. It takes all of us.
It does take all of us. Do something today, do something tomorrow, do something the next day, and continue to show up in a consistent way. I think that's a great call to action to end our conversation. Juliette, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture this afternoon.
Thank you for having me again, Christina.
Of course, and as a reminder for folks who are listening, at AllVoices, we really believe in employees and employers being seen, heard, and understood, and know it's a requirement for the business to really succeed overall. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.